Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here, as always, in the John Hope Franklin Center for International and Interdisciplinary Studies. We're joined today by Professor Simone C. Drake, who's Associate Professor of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. She's the author of Critical Appropriations, African American Women in the Construction of Transnational Identity, which was published by Louisiana State University in 2014, and also authored the forthcoming When We Imagine Grace, Black Men in Subject Making, which will be published next spring by the University of Chicago Press. How are you doing, Simone?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Talking a little bit about this first book of yours, what were you hoping to accomplish with it?
Well, I wanted to work to position African American women who are immobile or do not necessarily travel outside of the United States as contributing to transnational studies and also having certain sensibilities that shape their identities.
So, I mean, when you think about just as kind of a passing pop culture reference, like when you listen to Jay-Z talk about my passport says Sean, there's a kind of privilege that comes with folks who can have passports, right? Folks who can afford to travel, folks who have the time to be able to travel abroad. And you make a very compelling argument here that, when we think about Black transnational culture, we often think that it's only folks who can travel that are contributing to it, right? You've laid out an argument about the creation of a Black transnational identities, Black transnational culture by folks who aren't necessarily traveling in that same way. Whether or not they're fictional characters in novels or popular culture figures. I mean, talk about some of the folks that really compelled you to think more deeply about this issue.
Well, I think one of the things I thought about was, this project started in graduate school, so it was a long time coming. But with both the idea of the transnational as well as diaspora studies, there was always this sense of movement, of actual physical movement. And then when you kind of look at some of the key texts that have been done on cultural producers who are considered to be diasporic, it tends to be men.
Yeah.
It tends to be Richard Wright or Chester Himes.
Right.
Or it might be someone like Josephine Baker, but who literally crossed over.
Packed up and left. Right.
And I think this privilege that you talk about with mobility is very much at the heart of why Black women are not included as much.
Because it's gendered also. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Right. So you get this sort of immobility, or when women are moving, and I think people like Carol Boyce Davies, Mary Helen Washington have talked about their movement. They do it, but it's different. A lot of times it might be more domestic, more related to domestic work,
right.
Like with Caribbean migration,
right.
During like the World War II era and even after.
Yeah.
But it's not with the privilege of going elsewhere to write, right, or to produce ideas, to be an intellectual.
So an expatriate, right? To think about Baldwin or Richard Wright, musicians like Quincy Jones or Donald Byrd just kind of hanging out. I mean, even Kanye and Jay-Z, right? Niggas in Paris, right? It's a different kind of narrative that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, and I have a chapter on Beyonce, and obviously she has traveled internationally,
right.
But she still chooses to make her home here in the United States. And so with her, I look at the ways in which she appropriates Latina dub through collaborations with Shakira, primarily on her B-Day album. But those appropriations, I think, give us a different sense of her as a transnational subject in ways that not doing those do not. And she actually redid that CD, went back and added the Spanish language tracks to go along with it that I think give her a more broad and international presence, which she already had, but a different type of way of looking at her and thinking about her from that point. And so I also think about writers, African American women writers, or Caribbean
Gail Jones.
writers.
Right.
Yes, Gail Jones, Toni Morrison, Danzy Senna.
Caucasian.
And with Morrison, it was Paradise. And also Erna Braber, whose novel Louisiana. And then Casey Lemon's film Eve's Bayou.
Yeah.
So looking at these various different ways in which these women appropriate different theories of cultural identity that are often thought of as being located outside of the US. So like Candomblé or Voodoo or Latinidad in Beyonce's case, or Brazilianness, which in Caucasia. The ways in which they take those theories and use them to help shape and construct transnational, at least sensibilities about their own identities. And it's not just to trying to, in some way move into being part of this transnational discourse. I also look at it as situating, thinking about kind of what came before these women's work, thinking about Black women's novels in particular produced in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s that were very focused on family, community, kinship, and thinking about
domestic life. Right.
And thinking about the ways in which that focus and kind of construction of a Black female identity was limiting, and kind of produced some really homogenous ways of thinking about Black womanhood, about thinking about strength, that in the text I examine, we can see Black women pushing back against, or at least looking for something more, which is a line I love from Toni Morrison's Paradise. Sometimes folk need more. And I think very much what I'm looking at in this book is the ways in which Black women are trying to find the more. And oftentimes it becomes in these sort of syncretic, hybrid theories of cultural identity that give them something more than like US-based identities around race.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here in the John Hope Franklin Center talking with Professor Simone C. Drake, who's Associate Professor, brandly newly minted tenured Associate Professor of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. She's also the author of the most recent book, Critical Appropriations, African American Women in the Construction of Transnational Identity, and that was published by Louisiana State University Press. Now, I'm going to shift to a little bit here. And I know, when I introduce you to folks, I'm always giving you like 6, 7, 8, 9 boys. but you only actually have 3 sons.
Yes.
And so, as a Black woman scholar who considers herself doing feminist work, but who's also raising 3 sons, you perhaps are in this very unique position to consider things like the White House initiatives, like My Brother's Keeper, and now, of course, the White House initiative on women and girls of color. Talk about how you feel about, the initial focus on Black men and boys, with My Brother's Keeper, the pressure that was, of course, exerted on the White House to respond, and now this response.
Well, okay, so there's a lot that I thought about that. And I think initially it wasn't just so much that I have 3 boys. I mean, naturally I'm going to be very cognizant and advocate for Black boys, but that means that I'm also really hypersensitive to ways in which we represent. And so with the My Brother's Keeper, the initial issue I had with the first report that got put out was that the data was disaggregated, or well, no, they failed to disaggregate it, and so I didn't see that as making as solid of a case as needed to be made, and so that was kind of where I stood with that. But then also just with the kind of constant rhetoric, and even when I was taking law courses, it seemed to be the only way to talk about Black people was as being male, urban, poor, and on their way to incarceration. And so that, and My Brother's Keeper is not necessarily vested in that discourse, but I think it comes out of that.
Right, right.
And
right.
so I'm also always thinking about making sure that my sons understand that they can be and are something different than what the national narrative is.
Yeah.
And they do have the privilege
Right.
afforded to them by the life that
Right, two professional parents, right? Yeah.
But at the same time, my sixth grader is in middle school now, and it's off to a rocky start. I mean, so we our professional status does not necessarily mean that he could not fit those statistics,
Right.
because he thinks it's boring. He wants to be social. The academics are a little harder now, but they also aren't really very interesting, and that social aspect is. So,
Yeah.
He doesn't have a lot of the social ills that many African American boys will face, but the perception of him as an African American
right.
boy can still affect him in spite of his class status.
Right, gets
And-
reproduced. Both of these are policy initiatives that are coming relatively late in the Obama presidency. If any of it was really enacted, President Obama won't be in the White House to imagine how successful they may or may not be. How important are these kind of policy initiatives, right? And they're very public things, right? They get rolled out, and so many national pundits are writing pieces about it, and they spend time on the corporate news cable stations. How important do you think these kind of policy initiatives are to responding to some of the issues raised, like, for instance, Black Lives Matter, which deserve a different kind of policy attention, though they are clearly related in some ways?
For me, and particularly because I try to find ways in which my academic work can also extend to outreach work and community engagement, I think there has to be collaboration around on the policies, or so for example with the My Brother's Keeper and with the funds that are becoming available. A lot of them aren't necessarily becoming available for universities to develop programming. It's more for community-based,
Right.
Which is can be a good thing, but I think there needs to be collaboration between the people who do the research as well as the people who do programming,
Right.
so that you actually really do have effective programming and not just programming for programming's sake. And I have seen some of that where, this needs to be restructured a little bit.
A little bit more thoughtfulness behind the programming, yeah.
And so for me, that's one really critical aspect of policy that needs to be taken to heart if we expect to really maximize our outcomes.
You're watching Left to Black. We're here with Professor Simone C. Drake from The Ohio State University. I know you've recently in some of your writings are focused on Black visual culture. I know you had a chance to see the Kehinde Wiley show, months ago at the Brooklyn Museum. And he strikes me as a very interesting figure now. I mean, Black art's in an interesting space now, right? You're seeing Kehinde Wiley's on Empire. You're seeing folks like Fahamo Piku on Blackish, right? So, all this kind of random Black art that's in the background of these very mainstream television shows. But, Wiley, who's been doing this for a long time, or longer than most folks know, suddenly has caught the attention of mainstream media. So you're watching pieces, CBS This Morning and all these kind of places. Does it strike you as odd that we're focusing on a Black visual artist who really is focusing on Black male bodies at the same time that Black male bodies really mean something very different, in the real world, right? There's a beauty in which he's depicting Black male bodies in so much of his work, and that beauty is never translated into the everyday lives of Black men. People don't necessarily see beauty walking down the street in the same way.
I do think it's ironic. And so on the one hand, I love what Wiley's work is doing with kind of moving us back to the aesthetics.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the way in which he incorporates kind of the contemporary flair of hip hop with like the Baroque and the Rococo style and appropriation as well. And I think oftentimes, the aesthetics are lost in Black political projects, right? And so you don't get you get the politics and not the aesthetics. And it's something, even with someone like Toni Morrison, like, yes, it's political, but we can't miss the language.
Right.
We can't miss the beauty of the language.
Right.
And so with Wiley's work, I think, at least in the kind of mainstream popular realm, it's a peculiar representation of aesthetics that people are struck by, but I'm not so sure that they're going deeper than that. Even in some of the catalogs about his work, it's kind of surfacey. You don't get to go as deep as I think his work is pushing us.
What do you think that's about? Is it just a general inability to consider the Black subject as something that deserves a higher level of engagement? Are folks just caught up in the prettiness of it, if you will?
I think to some extent, because there's a certain risqueness to his work, especially in regards to sexuality and vulnerability, but at the same time, he's not doing anything dangerously risque. Right? So so I think it's not going to kind of turn to that type of attention. And so I think it sticks more towards the, isn't this interesting? And that's kind of where it is.
We've been joined today by Professor Simone C. Drake from The Ohio State University, where she is an associate professor of African American and African history. She's the author of Critical Appropriations, African American Women and the Construction of Transnational Identity, which was published last year by LSU Press. And she's also the author of the forthcoming When We Imagine Grace, Black Men and Subject Making. That's the University of Chicago Press. It'll be published in the spring of 2016. We look forward to having you back on the show to talk about that book.
I look forward to coming.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.